Hi, it's Josette here. Book study number 1. I chose Why Rural Schools Matter. Reason I chose this book was because I live, teach, grew up in a rural district. I teach at the same district I went to school at. And there's changes that have been made even since I was in school here. When reading Tikin's book, she talks about the meaning of school in chapter 1. She talks about the rural histories in chapter 2. She talks about researching rural in chapter 3 and where the heart is in chapter 4. Well, in her first chapter, she talks about the relationships that are shared between the school and its community and how important it is for those relationships to be in place. She describes her memories of working in a rural school district. Now, those are the kinds of memories we make today in our area, at our school. And so she wasn't far off, and it was a very good introduction and brought back a lot of memories to how I grew up and the stories that I was told by my mom, my grandma, my dad about the schools in the area during a time when we had many little townships up and down Highway 12. And each township had its own school, had its own church, and everybody went to school. All the kids went to school. But the boys would drop out early because they'd go to work in the coal mine to help support their family. And for the girls in our area, they'd marry off early, so their families didn't have to incur the monies it would take to keep raising all of their kids. And yes, they had a lot of kids. But in her introduction and her descriptions, it is almost like I'm reading about our own place. And when she talked about why she wanted to be a rural teacher, I love being a rural teacher. I know everyone's name. I know everyone's family. I probably grew up with most of them and probably related to most of them. So it makes for an interesting community. It makes for a more personal level of teaching. Because you can bring everything that you've learned, you can bring everything that you know from your histories to the students of today. When she talks about a rural rationale, she gets into the skepticism of that she encountered along the way, and that it was likely less about population count and demographics than about mythology. On page 7, she clearly states that stereotypes and assumptions about rural communities and people are laced throughout popular culture and perpetuated by mainstream media. Yeah, I tend to agree with that. The media likes to paint their pictures the way they want to and try and get people to believe what they're telling them. Don't always believe what you see and read is what we tell our kids, because you never know. Unless you've been there and you've seen it firsthand, you can't make assumptions. The 2 myths that she talks about, the first one being deprivation and decline, where rural is considered backwoods, backward, and the residents assumed to be ignorant, lawless, and provincial. Its community is a little different than those portrayed in the movie Deliverance. So, we joke around about calling ourselves Hicks from the Sticks. Well, we may be Hicks from the Sticks, but we're educated Hicks from the Sticks. And that assumption that we're not educated in, rural areas is a big assumption on their part, and it's a wrong assumption. The second myth draws from a romantic nostalgia. This rural is equated with uncomplicated simplicity, with some sort of lost golden age, an image that, while kinder, is no more accurate than the first. And threaded through both of these myths is the assumption that rural means white, whether salt of the earth white farming family or poor white trash. These myths serve to ensure the status of rural communities as either relics or wretches in the public imagination, and obscure rural complexities and realities, inaccuracies that lead to marginalizing entire communities of people and forgetting entire schools of children. Places I've been, and they ask, where are you from? And so you try and explain to them, we're 20 miles outside of the nearest town. And they're like, oh, well, where's that? You say Southern Colorado, and they don't think of anything lower than Pueblo. But when you're trying to explain to them, they kind of lose interest and they don't want to talk to you anymore, which is really kind of sad because we have as unique a life as people in the city. And in some cases, I think, we probably make more memories because our communities all come together. Everybody in the community comes together for our students, for our kids, for our families. There's no one that gets left out. Everybody here is a neighbor. Everybody here knows if somebody needs help. Everybody here knows if our students need help. And everybody's willing to back them up and help them get what they need. I don't find that to be the same in cities. I think they don't make the same kind of memories that we do. Not that it's wrong, but we make memories and we create roots and put our roots down where we can actually come back and pick up where we left off with people that we grew up with, people that we've known all our lives. As I started reading chapter 2, she is a lot about history of the rural schools, which is fine. We kind of need to know that. And she describes it very well. She did a lot of her research very well. And she talks about the urbanization and rural problems. Well, you're always going to have those problems. It's not going to change. But they lump the rural problem as the problem that makes all of education not work. Well, it's not just the rural schools. And she talks about how in the cities, the schools became crowded and that the reformers seized the challenge to reform school education. And school administration shifted to a corporate style bureaucracies filled with professionals. And these professionals, well versed in the science of management, were charged with overseeing the legions of teachers now produced by normal schools. Teacher training was formalized, and graduates were credentialed. Schools were reorganized, and graded classrooms were introduced. Curricula were examined, and textbook content was standardized. Community involvement diminished as the often informal and certainly unregulated voluntary contributions of residents. So basically, and that's from page 14 of the Rural Histories. So basically, because the city schools became overpopulated, and they decided that, yes, we needed more trained teachers, which not a bad thing. But it started to lose as far as community involvement. They didn't want to do any of it. They didn't want to have to work that hard for education for their children. And we're back to the approach as before in history, where there's only one best system, and it's a standardized system that everybody teach the same way, the same books, the same content. And it was driven by the demands of the country's growing cities, not your rural areas. It was driven by cities that were growing by leaps and bounds, many students coming to the cities. Rural areas were losing important people, parts of their community being enticed into the city. So they got more students, so they felt that we needed to have reform. Well, just because that happens in the city doesn't mean that the rural schools were doing a bad job. And when she talks about a rural problem, she states that as American cities thrived and its urban schools scrambled to keep pace, its rural areas suffered. Despite industrialist dependence on farms for raw materials, urban and rural interests had long been at odds. And further down, she talks about the novels, newspaper articles, and magazine stories that documented the backwardness of rural life and painted an image of the future as a life lived in cities. America's rural identity was fading. Urban interests now captured public imagination. With its promises of prosperity and cosmopolitanism, the city enticed rural residents to, and soon rural communities began to lose population. Very true. A lot of people I went to school with sought to raise their kids in the city. They didn't want them to stay in the rural area. I don't think that their kids are any more successful than any of the kids that we have. My kids were raised in the same school district I went to school in. And they're very proficient in what they do. They've been introduced to the same things that inner city schools are introduced to as far as academic. She goes on to talk about the turn of the 20th century, advance in transportation and communication, shaping the city life. We're also remaking rural communities. It's not a bad thing, because then we can actually get students to school, and more and more children started going to school because there was a way for them to get there. Some people who live far out from the schools didn't send their kids to school because it took too long to get there. Now we have buses. Buses can pick the kids up. Buses can take the kids home. So transportation and communication have really helped the rural areas to stay caught up to what they're doing in the cities, in bigger cities. She talked about the school solutions. The first was an 1896 report by the Committee of 12, a committee of prominent educators appointed by the National Education Association, that concluded that the country's rural schools suffered from inefficiency, a lack of standards, an absence of state oversight, a want of official and intelligent supervision, and an abundance of untrained, immature teachers. The underlying problem of rural schools, they argued, was the influence of the local community. Others soon echoed these claims. This is on page 16. I agree somewhat, because you do need trained teachers to teach your children. Not everybody can teach. not everybody was meant to teach. And in the early 1900s and in late 1800s, you had people teaching that couldn't do anything else. So they were put in charge of teaching our children. Well, now, to stay caught up with the world, you have to have highly qualified teachers in place to teach your children. And more and more, your teachers are specializing in an area, not in all subjects. And though your elementary schools, most of them, still just have one teacher per room, you see more and more that they have what's called specials. So you have your art teacher and they're teaching the art to your elementary kids. Your basic homeroom teacher in elementary is now just teaching ELA, math, maybe some science and some social studies. But everything else outside of your core classes is taught by somebody else. They have library time, they have art, they have PE. That isn't being taught by the same teacher that they have for everything else. So we've even grown from the homeroom teacher doing all of the teaching of all of the subjects. And it talks about the effects that reform has had on rural schools, and that it was dramatic. But many of these reforms offered their own problems. In this area, when they decided they were going to reorganize and consolidate, a lot of people left the area. And we had Sopris, that is near Trinidad. We had Fredericks, Valdez, Segundo, Primero, Weston, Teserio, Stonewall, Vigil, and all of these little places all had a school. They all had church. And if you think about all of those schools that were here, and now we have one school, and that's the Primero School District. And its actual title is the Primero RE2 Reorganized School District. So yes, we were reorganized long time ago. Professionals working in centralized state bureaucracies appropriated schooling decisions and focused on efficiency and standardization. Most rural students attended safer, more modern school buildings. Some received a nature-filled place-based curriculum, reflecting the more science intentions of the country life movement. We're still based on science up this way. I mean, there's a lot to our area. But as far as the schools themselves, some of the schools here were probably pretty dangerous to be in. But for the most part, they were all pretty well maintained buildings. And some of them still stand today. Some of them are you just find the remnants. One is buried under Trinidad Lake. That's the town of Sopris. But all of a sudden, Trinidad School District grew. Our area kind of lost some people. And you still had your farmer kids that were out east. Well, it did change the numbers of people in our area by quite a bit. So she kept going through the histories. She talked about the rural loss, consolidation, desegregation, and schools closing. And she talks about the results of consolidation carrying meaning for rural students and communities. Consolidation may bring opportunities for students, more course offerings, new friendships, but there are often drawbacks too. Long bus rides, limited opportunities to participate in after-school activities, less individual attention from teachers and staff, and reduced parental involvement. Well, here, our kids have all the opportunities in the world to participate in activities. And they did earlier in this century also, or well, in the 1900s. Buses transported them. And then the state was broken down into districts, and we're still called districts, but now there's a blur of the district line, and kids can cross district lines and go to whatever school they want to. Then when I was in school, you couldn't cross that line. You could not cross from Primero District into Trinidad District number 1. You had to go to the school that you were living in that district. So now, in our rural schools, our kids can receive one-on-one tutoring. The parents stay involved. And I honestly find that it helps our kids grow more, and they become more educated, even in the histories, because they listen to the stories that the old timers here tell. They are not distracted by all the extra opportunities in the city to go do stuff. Here they make their memories. Here they make the time and they talk to people in this area that have lived here all their lives. And they learn about what their school was about, where it came from, how it was developed. And they have a deeper appreciation for our community and our school. When Tikin talks about tracing a relationship in the community school and state schooling, she's still talking about reform, and she talks about reform a lot, which I think we all understand education is reformed. But the connections she makes is with your state and your government and how it affects all the schools, whether they're urban schools or rural schools. But in the rural communities, okay, the rural communities determined what was taught, who was taught, and how. And schools prepared youth for lives they would live in their rural communities. So before the introduction of all the technology, the students were being raised to work in the same profession their families did. That's what they knew. Here, boys would only go to school till maybe the 6th grade, and then they'd go to work in the mine. Girls might receive a higher education, but as soon as they were of age to marry, they were married off. And so here, yeah, it's still kind of dictated how, who, what, when, and why. But as reform came and times began to change, we started to see technology come in. Now we're starting to train our kids for what they want to do. And our kids today are making better decisions on their likes and dislikes. Some like science, some don't. The ones that like science, we try and generally steer, but we're still trying to steer them to that kind of profession. Doesn't make it wrong. But from the beginning of time till now, we're still training our kids for a profession. Just now, it's not in the same things that we do. If they were farmers, their kids were farmers. And you have farms here that are generations old, that the great grandkids are now running the farm. And as she went through, she did talk about locating relationships, a lot about Delight and Earl in Arkansas, divisions based on geography, race, and schools. And the biggest thing that I got from the end of this chapter was she talked about today's divisions. The divisions today in Arkansas have been evident in its educational funding. So not all the schools in Arkansas receive the same monies, which we don't hear either. It's based on how many students you have. But after they had years of argument about insufficiencies in school funding between districts, the Arkansas Supreme Court ruled that the state's funding scheme was unconstitutional, both inherently inadequate and inequitable, and that the state government had failed in its obligation to educate the state's children. He found that the schools that were segregated based on race, the white schools were getting more money than the black schools. And so when it was found to be unconstitutional, Arkansas was forced to change their ways. Well, here they have the formula. You have your October 1 count, and you receive school monies based on the number of students you are teaching on that day. Does that mean that's the same number of students you teach every day, all year? Probably not. Some move in, some move out. But at least it's a constitutional way of schools receiving monies. After she talked about today's divisions, and it took a little while for her to get through it, she started talking about relationships by design. A lot about relationships in chapter 3 and 4, which maybe we should have just kept relationships to one chapter, but it all read the same. The relationships you make is what defines your character. And when you talk about chapter 4, where the heart is, she talks about school relationships and the Delight community, and about, even though she'd been gone and she'd be back and forth, returning to Delight, it was like returning home. The people still doing the same things that they did when she had visited before. She was welcome to sleep on the couch of the principal's house, invited to join the fundraiser dinner at the school. And just like if you leave and you come home, everything still looks the same. Yeah, there's some differences, but here, if people come back now, they're going to see a different school building. Same outside, different inside. But that doesn't mean that the ideals of our community have changed. We still are a community that wants to educate our children. There's a lot of times that you'll find that people will come together for the extracurricular activities. Here in our community, in a rural area, everybody in our area, an extended family that comes from another school district in a similar situation, rural area, they all come out to support our kids and our students at these functions. And I find that in a city school, the ones that show up are the ones that have people performing. The entire school doesn't show up for an elementary play. Where here, pretty much everybody that's close by or related to shows up to support their kids. So I relate to this book in the fact that I live it every day. I lived it. My mom lived it. My grandmother lived it. My dad lived it. And my dad grew up in town, which was different than where my mom grew up in the coal camp. And when she gets to the end of the chapter, she talks about how you know your teachers by name, and that you can leave and come back and have a conversation with them. And it's like you never left. And on page 67, she talks about small towns, small schools have great big hearts, and they value things in a different way than you do in a larger school and larger town. And yet another parent clarifies what goes on here in this town between the moral values taught in school, in the churches, the extra attention produced by other teachers, the care and the knowledge that the community has toward each other. All of that cannot be duplicated in a large town. I agree with that. Wholeheartedly agree with that. I've seen firsthand how everybody here supports everybody. Doesn't mean we get along all the time, but we know we all have the same idea in mind, and that's to support our students. Our students here, it's not much about race, and it's really not much about white privilege here. Here, it's about helping each other to understand. We still have a lot of people coming into our area. And believe it or not, our area grew on the immigrants that came to make a better life for themselves and their family. Education in this part of the country changed because they couldn't understand each other. The whites didn't understand what they were saying, and they didn't understand what the whites were saying. So education reform began, and they started teaching English, so everyone could understand what was going on. Those relationships were built. Those relationships created. We still create those relationships today. And here, we do it together. It's not separate. And I find in the cities, not everybody is as interested. Yeah, they want their kids educated, but don't bother them when you need help. Here, it's everybody asks, what can we do to help? And the evidence came this last fall when we had it on the ballot to improve our school. And our community stood behind the school and passed the bond. And now we are updating our school, thanks to our community and the relationships we've built.